Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to see you all here and to have you with me for the third of 4 talks I'm giving this year about the present state of thinking about conservation. And when I say the present state, I'm talking about my present state of thinking about conservation. And this lecture this evening, I think for some people will arouse some quite strong feelings, because it is one of the things that people feel very strongly about, the way that new buildings fit into old places. Well, much of conservation philosophy, and in fact, I'd say almost all of conservation legislation, concentrates on individual buildings, their fabric and their significance. However, in practice, many, if not most, of the complex issues facing protecting and enhancing the environment in which we live are about new buildings and their impact on old ones. In 2003, on my desk, on my very first day as Chief Executive of English Heritage, was a proposal for a very tall building at London Bridge in Southwark, of course now known universally as the Shard. I inherited an extremely strong view from the staff and from our advisory committees that this would be a highly detrimental addition to London, a building that would destroy the historic setting of hundreds of listed buildings and conservation areas. But of course, no actual physical fabric was going to be lost. But of course, the argument was that the meaning of buildings from St. Paul's Cathedral to St. George's Hospital would be forever compromised. Well, this is what I want to talk about this evening. How do we make judgments about the impact of new buildings on a vast scale like this, or even on a smaller scale, on the setting of historic places? How we decide whether new and old together enhance the old or detract from it. But before we get into detail, I think we need to make some clear distinctions and definitions, so we're all absolutely clear what we are talking about. So, when I talk about setting, I mean the relationship between a historic building and its surroundings in the present and in the past. And that includes the way that a place is perceived, experienced, and valued by people today. So, when we talk about the setting of Salisbury Cathedral, it is the physicality of the cathedral close in all its depth of period and space. In parallel, the context of a historic building is something slightly different. The context encompasses any relationship between the building and other places. And this potentially has many, many aspects. These could be cultural, could be intellectual, spatial, functional, and it could be drawn very widely. So, for instance, you could look at the links between a building and all the other buildings built by the same architect. That would be the context of that building. So, I'll give you another example. This is a building I mentioned a couple of lectures ago in Kensington, the Commonwealth Institute. The context of this building embraces not only its landscape, but the weight of meaning attached to the place. The establishment of the Commonwealth, the way that this building was made up of materials that were donated by Commonwealth countries. They came from all over the world. And in the way that this building symbolises the optimism of the post-war years. These wider associations of context don't fall within the specific meaning of setting as established in terms of planning legislation. Nevertheless, I think it would be very difficult to argue that the context of a building wasn't anything other than part of its setting, if you see what I mean. You can't disassociate the Commonwealth Institute from the ideas that brought it about. So when we're considering the impact of new buildings on the setting and context of old ones, there are several layers of judgment that have to be made, and in making those judgments, there are actually very few tools at hand. And on this evening's lecture, I want to focus a little bit on what those tools might be and how you might set out to make such judgments. Now, I think that making aesthetic judgments about architecture is a very complex business, and it raises issues that evaluating music, or painting, or literature actually doesn't. And the most important of these, I think, is the functionality of architecture. Unlike other art forms, architecture has a utility. Architecture can't be understood in isolation from its function, and it's not possible to separate the aesthetic effect of a building from the function that it fulfills. So, when we judge a building, we are likely to admire one as beautiful that works like a well-oiled log, where people can go about their business in a smooth and ordered manner. A building that is confusing and frustrating to use, such as the Barbican Centre, may have claims to aesthetic merit, but they are not through the beauty of the smooth functionality. Whereas the British Library, by Sandy St. John Wilson, is universally agreed by people who use it to be a wonderful place to work, hugely adding to its aesthetic appeal. So, the functionality of architecture sets it apart from other art forms. Secondly, although new inventions are made in other art forms, such as acrylic paint or an electric guitar, and these, of course, can change the product, architecture and its effects are fundamentally fashioned by developing technical competence. So, the invention of the sash window, the invention of plate glass, here you see some being made in the Victorian period, the invention of structural cast iron or reinforced concrete, all these things opened new chapters in architectural aesthetics. Aesthetics and architectural technology and engineering develop hand in hand. The third thing that sets architecture apart from other types of art is that its audience is different too. Architecture has a universal audience. Writers, composers, and painters have to create a public for their own work, while architects have a public by definition. Architecture is a public art. It's there when you wake up, it's there when you go to sleep. It is inescapable and imposes itself on people whether they like it or not. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why people care so much about it. So, when we consider beauty in architecture, we have to embrace functionality, technical competence, and audience, all of which are factors that make buildings inherently different in terms of aesthetic criticism. But there is a fourth and critical difference, and that is locality. It is not possible to separate the locality of a building from its aesthetic impact. Other art forms are almost all mobile. You can carry a painting around and hang it in different places to achieve contrasting juxtapositions and different meanings. You can play a piece of music in a church and the same piece of music in a railway station, and you get different responses. But a building is where it is, and its aesthetic impact is static unless, for some reason, its surroundings change. So, Chatsworth House is beautiful as much for its landscape setting as for William Talman's architecture. Dennis Lasdon's ziggurats at the University of East Anglia are likewise defined by their relationship to the land and the water just off the slide that surrounds them. Here is Lancaster Castle, which you can see in the middle of the slide. And as you can see, it is defined by its setting next door to the Abbey and the other town churches. This is St Mary's Church in Taunton, viewed down Hammett Street, a Georgian street that is now as much part of the aesthetic impact of the church as the wonderful tower that was finished in 1508. So all of this is to say the obvious, which is that the effect of a building is always enhanced or diminished by its surroundings. And this point is, of course, fundamental to my topic this evening, because inherent in aesthetic judgments about architecture are judgments about the way buildings compose with their surroundings. The aesthetic impact of a building and its setting just can't be disentangled. One consequence of these special characteristics about architecture, functionality, competence, audience, and locality, is that it is much more difficult to make judgments about architectural aesthetics than it is, I think, to make judgments about a painting, a symphony, or a ballet. Indeed, I would also argue that there is a severely underdeveloped language and critical apparatus for this type of criticism. Yet, architectural aesthetics have a huge impact on society, on personal happiness, on well-being, even actually on our health. Campaigns and societies spring up to stop a skyscraper, to stop a shopping centre or a waste incinerator being built. Other groups spring up to prevent a church, a town hall, or a country house from being demolished. Certainly, the motivations of these campaigns are not all aesthetic. A waste destructor, for instance, may be emitting toxins into the air. It's not just because it doesn't look nice. But most of these campaigns have an aesthetic content. Of course, it is possible to dismiss such architectural campaigns as merely manifestations of personal taste. Taste, of course, can just be seen as random personal preference, which doesn't really have to be taken very seriously. But architectural taste need not, in my view, necessarily be merely capricious. It can be the exercise of judgment and can spring from something much deeper than merely caprice. Taste is influenced by thought and by education. It expresses moral, religious, and political outlooks and feelings. In this way, I think that our taste is as much part of our rational nature as any scientific or moral judgment that we might exercise. And this, of course, means that taste can change, both the taste of individuals and the taste of societies. Prevailing taste, the taste that the aggregate of people in this room will share, is, of course, known as fashion, a word used damningly as expressing the most rapid, vapid changes in public likes and dislikes. And like discussions about taste, fashion can be used to dismiss the concerns of people who want to stop new buildings or preserve old ones. Yet, fashion, through rational thought and intellectual refinement, can become established and might even be argued for on empirical terms. And so this, of course, opens up one of the great debates about art generally and architecture in particular. Is architectural beauty absolute, or is it relative? In other words, does it lie in the building and its setting, or is it merely in the eye of the beholder? Is it inherent, or is it just fashion? Well, the earliest writer to address this issue that we know of was Vitruvius in the early years of the Roman Empire. And he proposed that the most solid, useful, and beautiful architecture derived from the proportions of the human body. And this ideal, rediscovered in the 15th century, led to Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, a diagram to demonstrate how ideal architectural proportions can be derived from the human body. From about 1714, a series of English architectural books promoted a style of building based on these rules. Critics often called this Palladiumism, and there's Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, a Palladian building. And in Palladianism, beauty could be achieved by following rules. And critics could consult the texts and judged for themselves how effectively the architects had applied those rules. And therefore there was an empirical way of judging whether a building like this was beautiful or not. The modern movement in architecture also made a case for the existence of an intrinsic beauty. Here is Finsbury Health Centre. This wasn't born of a set of rules, but born of a belief that the form of a building should follow and express its function without the intervention of imagery or symbolism. And this functionalist ethic, the machine ethic if you like, was likewise deemed susceptible to judgment against an established norm. You held up the norm and a building was either beautiful or it wasn't. It either complied or it didn't comply. In his famous and quite tedious book, The Stones of Venice, John Ruskin wrote, and I quote, "I had always a clear conviction that there was a law in this matter, that good architecture might be indisputably discerned and divided from the bad, and that we were all of us just as unwise in disputing about the matter without reference to principle as we should be for debating about the genuineness of a coin without ringing it." Now, before the late 19th century, it mattered perhaps only to a very small group of patrons and connoisseurs whether buildings were in fact beautiful or not. And even Ruskin, William Morris and their fellow critics had the leisure of writing about architecture without any concrete responsibility for it. But in 1882, for the first time, it started to matter whether buildings were good, bad, beautiful, or ugly in terms of the law of the land. Because it was in that year that the first Ancient Monuments Act was passed. This was the first piece of legislation to protect man-made structures in Britain, establishing the principle that the state, in the form of the commissioners of the Board of Public Works, could take into their care any of an agreed list or schedule of what were called ancient monuments. Of course, the early inspectors of ancient monuments, and here's my great hero, Sir Charles Peers, the first inspector of ancient monuments, these people would have denied that they were making aesthetic judgments in the process of identifying what monuments should be saved. But as the heritage protection system and the planning system grew, the process by which government employees exercised aesthetic judgment became more and more entrenched. So who were these early inspectors and planning officers who started to make judgments about a huge range of planning matters, especially after the Town and Country Planning Act and the coming of the modern listing of buildings after the Second World War? Well, the answer was that these people, like Sir Charles Peers, were generally architects. Men, and a few women, highly trained in making architectural judgments and well-versed in architectural history and knowledgeable about vernacular building materials. The 300 original investigators who were drafted in by the government after the Blitz in London to identify which buildings should be saved and which ones should be demolished were all architects, as well as following what other skeletal criteria had been set by the Ministry of Works. These people exercised their architectural judgment in making their decisions. Their preferences were highly refined by an understanding of architectural history and the development of architecture in England. But as that generation of architects who had been employed on listing immediately after the war died away, they were replaced by something entirely different. The new generation of architects, steeped in enthusiasm for the modern movement, and here's Robin Hood Gardens, had little interest in a dead-end career criticising buildings whose styles they neither knew nor cared about. And so their role in the planning system was replaced not by architects, but by historians, people like me. So, a great divide occurred. By the 1960s, new architecture ploughed one furrow, divorced from its historical roots, and the government inspectors and investigators ploughed another, steeped in art history. Thus, when in 1981, recognising the inadequacy of the original historic building lists, Michael Heseltine set up a new survey of all the buildings in England to relist everything, he employed 80 field workers, every single one of whom was an archaeologist or historian. Few, if any, young architects would have actually been capable of doing the job, even if they had been interested in it. I've been on a little bit of a digression, but it's actually an extremely important one, because two crucial points need to be made. And these are, firstly, that making judgments about new buildings in old places is highly complex and requires critical faculties that other cultural criticism doesn't. And secondly, whilst originally these judgments were made by architects, architects lost first the desire to make them and then the right to make them during the 1960s and the 1970s. By right, I mean that just as the art historians and archaeologists in the planning system made judgments about architectural aesthetics informed by time depth of their surroundings, so did the public. Public taste never warmed to architecture built without a historic context. Because historical context is the thing that informs and develops taste. Modernism in England wasn't condemned by critics, it was condemned by the public, by people who were forced to live in tower blocks, queue in municipal offices, shop in supermarkets, people whose field of vision was dominated by stained concrete and monotonous, unrelieved facades, people who escaped death in the collapsing Ronan Point tower block in 1968. So the public didn't trust architects to make judgments on the places where they lived. They saw them and their fellows in the municipal planning departments not as the creators of nice places to live, but as the destroyers of them. So what do we make of this? My fundamental contention is that architectural aesthetics cannot be judged on a set of simple criteria. Judgment has to be much more complex. Its functionality, its competence, the audience, its locality mean that the critical apparatus needed to assess new architecture is bulky and rich, and it means that aesthetics alone are not enough. You can't judge architecture only on the basis of aesthetic appeal. To capture the depth and significance in building, you need to look more widely, and that means having people who are highly attuned to the issues involved. Now, before you think I am arguing for a core of elite aesthetes who float around condemning the ugly and praising the beautiful, I want to emphasize the fact that we have to allow for the shock of the new. Here is Inigo Jones's banqueting house in Whitehall. This is a building which probably would never have been allowed today. Historic England would have said, this building is built out of stone, everything else is built out of brick, it's twice, 3 times the size of everything else, its bulk, its style is completely compatible with the buildings around it. What about Tower Bridge? Here is a building that completely dominates the Tower of London in almost every single view. You might say, well, they tried to make it blend in stylistically, but did they? Where on the Tower of London are those steeply pitched roofs? Where are the lancet windows? And where's all that cast iron? Surely this Grade 1 listed building, the tower, the bridge, is the destroyer of the much older and more important Tower of London next to it. I could go on citing examples from the Scott Memorial in Edinburgh to Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. These were new buildings in old places that were no respecters of scale, materials, or of style. They brutally imposed themselves on the existing historic streetscapes and they bullied their way into our affections. So, how does a system for measuring the impact of a new building on an old place take an account of this issue? Because I guess that most people in this room, including me, have a great affection for Tower Bridge and think it's rather wonderful sitting there next door to the Tower of London. And here we come to the crux of the problem. It is notoriously difficult to judge an aggressively different type of new building, one that sets out to tear up the rules and start a new trend. The fact is, I believe, that cities must be allowed to continue to evolve. After the destruction by an IRA bomb of the Victorian Baltic Exchange in the centre of the city, there was a huge and protracted debate about what should happen to the site. Eventually, the owners of the site, the City of London and English Heritage, gave up on the shattered remains of the Victorian building, and a discussion began about its replacement. Through a protracted process that would take many hours and several lectures to describe, English Heritage came to the point where it supported Norman Foster's Swiss Ray building, the building now known as the Gherkin, as its replacement on the site. The setting of the surrounding buildings was a fundamental issue, not so much in the close-up as in the long view. And that judgment, I think, has stood the test of time. The shape of the building and its composition on the London skyline has proved to be an ornament to St Paul's Cathedral, and it is now a very popular new building. Well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what happened next, but the Gherkin was the start of a process that saw tall buildings approved willy-nilly, and in the end, I'm afraid, without much thought of what they were doing to the historic environment. The worst was unquestionably Raphael Vernoli's Fenchurch Street building, the so-called walkie-talkie. But this need not have been so. Cities, as the Gherkin proves, can take big and assertive buildings. They can actually enhance the historic environment. I happen to think that Liverpool City managed to preserve both the setting and the context of its two great cathedrals when it built the stadium and the convention centre on the waterfront of the River Mersey. A very successful addition. In a tougher urban context, more can be done and more contemporary addition can be successful. Here is the Liverpool Institute. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide an extension in a contemporary style, but reflecting the aesthetic of the Victorian building. It's of stone, it's got a rusticated basement, a protruding roofline that continues the horizontality of the cornice. At the other end of the street, it's really quite assertive with its curving glass, but the aesthetic of the original is still quite dominant. The fact is, I think, that our big cities are different to our towns and villages. Cities have always been places where architectural innovation has thrived. Manchester saw the invention of the Victorian warehouse. Birmingham saw the invention of modernist brutalism. Our cities have got to be allowed to be engines of architectural creativity, and the largest cities can actually take architectural mistakes and either live with them or see them replaced by succeeding generations. What I think is very different are the market towns and villages of England. And here, I think we urgently need to find some way to help local authorities keep the small-scale street pattern, the materials, and distinctive features of these places. We need a way of allowing new building, but only in as far as it subjugates itself to the wider artistic and historic whole that is the town itself. And this, I think, is where the big battles lie. Now, of course, our big, great cities are important, but the delicate balance that makes Newark, Pontefract, and Taunton beautiful is far more vulnerable than the robustness of Sheffield or Newcastle, let alone London. Moreover, the styles that are likely to be found in the smaller towns are, the skills that are likely to be found in the smaller towns are much less well developed. The cities have big, well-staffed and expert planning departments, and the NGOs keep their eyes on what they are up to. The profit margins in cities are much higher and allow for more skilled and costly design teams, so theoretically can produce better architecture. So we urgently have to draw out a distinction between the way London and the half-dozen great cities have developed and the sweep of our market and cathedral towns. As well as developing the techniques that enable us to argue for the future of our cities, tools that are now rapidly maturing, we must urgently develop a different and more subtle set of tools that can help local councillors and officers judge more effectively and objectively the impact of new buildings in smaller places, and by doing, preserve the unique qualities that make their towns and villages so special. Well, so far I've been talking in the abstract about style and taste. But now I need to turn to the more concrete and controversial approach to look at some actual cases and examples. And I want to start with a little bit of a retrospect and look back to the 1970s and look back at some of the more imaginative attempts by the first generation of modernist architects to blend in modern buildings with historic centres. And I want to start in Chester, where there has been a very long tradition of constructing new buildings respecting and reflecting the old. So, many of you here will know the Chester Rose, extraordinary development of architecture and shopping, which allows you to shop at this level, but also in this raised gallery that goes all the way along the street, the main street on both sides. Established in the late Middle Ages and recognised from them on as being important and beautiful. So, in the 17th century, here is an addition. You can see with the 17th century brickwork, the sort of Tuscan or Doric columns beneath, an addition in the 17th century to preserve the original appearance. Here is an addition of the 19th century. You can see very carefully constructed to turn the corner to preserve the way the rows work. Here is an infill from the 1970s. This is called Refuge House, a concrete framed building with bay windows, and it's sort of black and white. And here the architects have made a real effort to reflect the design, but obviously not the materials of the historic street. And be interested to know your views about whether you think that is a successful and valid addition to the medieval streetscape or whether it isn't. This is a multi-storey car park in Lowestoft, designed with great care and constructed very carefully in local materials. No doubt the municipal architects in the 1970s gave a convincing presentation when it was on the drawing board, outlining how the design and materials reflected the local context of building in Lowestoft. It's sited in the dock area, and it takes its theme, the warehouse. You can see the sort of warehouse windows, and its facing is constructed of napped flints, which is a locally very distinctive material. So these two examples from the 1970s, where architects tried to get their new buildings to blend into the old, I think are quite complex issues. I think if you were to write a brief for these two sites, you'd emphasise the importance of traditional forms and proportions, but also I think you'd emphasise the importance of materials. And in both examples, the architects have made interesting responses. Much better than, for instance, another building in Chester. Here is the Crown Plaza Hotel. Here, the architects, if there were any, must have argued that this building, with its half-timbering, was contextual, although it was on a ring road and the adjacent buildings were not half-timbered. I don't think anyone here would judge this building a success. So, since the birth of modernism, architects have attempted to find a way to build modern but look traditional. But what I want to argue for this evening is something, I'm afraid, that is deeply unfashionable, which is a return to traditional building in our market towns and villages. This is a subject greeted with horror and derision by most architects. They will leer at you and spit through clenched teeth the word pastiche. Now, I happen to think that pastiche is a very silly word. It's a term that means a work of art, a book, a tune, etc., composed in the style of a well-known artist. It was never originally a pejorative term, but it has become the ultimate insult an architect can throw at a fellow architect. This whole notion is of a very new making, because, of course, architects have always drawn on the work of other architects and have always been happy to design in styles that reflect and indeed imitate ones from the past. Let me just give you a very obvious example. I'm not going to dwell on this because hopefully this point will be very obvious to everyone in this room. I'm going to just look at Westminster Abbey for a moment. The Royal Minster, still today a royal peculiar, a building upon which, throughout its history, no expense has been spared. In 1272, Henry III died, and the nave of the abbey was left incomplete. Almost 100 years later, it was decided to finally complete the abbey. And, as the architects of the day set out to do this, they decided to complete it in the original style. For 150 years, through half a dozen stylistic changes in fashion, work continued on the nave that you see here and its arcades. And when it was finished in the 1530s, in style, it was indistinguishable from the work of the 13th century. All the great architects who worked into those hundreds of years had no compunction about continuing the style to blend in. Again, in the 17th century, when the Dean and Chapter decided to finally complete the West Towers, Nicholas Hawksmoor rebuilt the whole of the West End in a style that matched the rest of the building. So all of this here, these towers, all this front, all of this is designed by Hawksmoor. And Hawksmoor, of course, an architect who was extraordinarily original, inventive architect, perhaps one of the most inventive architects of all time. Okay, you might say, well, these are just two examples from one building, but we only need to look at the building that is directly across the road from Westminster Abbey, the Middlesex Guildhall. This remarkable building, now the home to the Supreme Court, was built in 1912 to 13. At this time, major civic buildings were being built in classical styles and not in Gothic styles anywhere in England. But it was considered that the genius of the place, close to the Abbey and the Houses of Parliament, it needed a Gothic style. And so we get this extraordinary Art Nouveau version of Gothic with this amazing series of historical friezes around it. So architects have long been happy to blend in their work with existing styles. So why not now? In some cases, I think it is entirely justifiable, indeed important, to commission new buildings in a vernacular style. In fact, I think it's downright arrogant to introduce new materials and styles of an aggressively contrasting nature in historic towns. I'm now going to show you one of my favourite aggressive interventions. This is a terrace of Regency houses outside the town hall in Lancaster. In an attempt not to be seen to be building a pastiche, the architect has inserted in this Regency terrace a glass infill into the facade. Brighton has a very strong historic character, of course, with a homogeneous historic building stock. Here you see old and new put together with this white stuccoed front. And so a new intervention that is unstuccoed brick just to me doesn't seem like the right thing to be building. The intervention might be good in scale, proportion and general design, but it just doesn't work because it's made of red brick. In many smaller towns, the historic character is captured in hundreds of years of harmonious development. And I think the interruption of this harmonious development is actually unjustifiable. Here is Marlborough High Street. Now, this is, I think, an extremely harmonious composition. Hundreds of historic buildings built more or less in the same materials, to more or less the similar scales, and using similar proportions. It doesn't engage us by surprise and contrast, but it seduces us by familiarity and by harmony. And this was not unplanned. No one should let you try and persuade you that this is an unplanned view, because, as we know, nothing is unplanned in a town like Marlborough. Its appearance was the product of hundreds of conscious decisions, many of which had the object of maintaining visual harmony at their core. But Marlborough is also a good example, as it has an ill-conceived modern intervention, which you see here on the right-hand side. And I'm sorry, it's a bit of a bad photograph, but you can see this huge, great big overscaled thing, poor in design, bad in materials, which just detracts significantly from the whole composition and is the only blot on an otherwise almost perfect historic street. I'm afraid my picture isn't perfect, but hopefully you'll get the gist. Now, I'll just give you some more examples of where I think it's important that new buildings sublimate their own identity for the benefit of the whole. Here is an old photograph of the Market Square in Devizes, where a 1950s Woolworths has recently been replaced by an extremely well-designed, well-built building in a vernacular style that I think handsomely reinforces the aesthetic significance of the square. A similar point can be made in Queen's Square, Bristol. Now, many of you may know this wonderful square. This is a print of it in 1831, and many of you will know that in the 1970s, the City Corporation drove a dual carriageway diagonally through the square, taking out these buildings in this corner here, moving the statue of William III out of the way. Very, very destructive. But brilliantly, recently, the road was got rid of, and the gap in the square, which was caused by the motorway, was filled in by this building. Pastiche, you will say. Pastiche! It shouldn't be allowed. But I think that this is a very, very, very good building. You can see at the back, it's got flats on it. The design of the square is much, much more important than the design of the individual building. Now, it works here, I think, and it works in Devizes, which I have shown you, because the detailing and the quality of these buildings is absolutely right. Significant sum of money has been spent on it. But where so many attempts to design in the style of fall down horribly is in the execution. Here is a photograph of a handsome seaside semi-detached house in Great Yarmouth. It's part of a a series of very handsome buildings on the seafront. They've got very sort of strong verticals with these, can you see these sashes piled up on top of each other, but linked by a sort of stone and brick surrounds. They've got these deep eaves, these very heavy, chunky coins on the corners, big string courses jutting out. Very handsome, not listable, but very nice building that you'd want to see on the seafront. Permission was granted to build a new range of these buildings, but in very, very close visual relationship. The result, I think, is disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. Superficially, they've got the coins on the corner, they've got the vertical windows, they've got the overhanging eaves, but really? There is a problem here that you may say, and I would have certainly said in this case, that it would have been important to build these new buildings in such a way that respects the vernacular traditions of the seafront at Great Yarmouth, and that the totality of the effect of the seafront was much more important than the individual buildings. If you don't get the buildings right, it is actually almost worse than building something completely different at all. Now, in Devizes, Bristol, and indeed in Great Yarmouth, we are talking about modern buildings that are composed in vernacular historical styles in order to preserve the harmony. But I think it is possible for the harmony to be maintained by the skillful intervention of a modern vernacular building in a contemporary style. Now, I'm not sure that the shops in Chester or the car park in Lowestoft entirely succeeded, but here is a building which I think is very good. This is Leonard Manessa's County Court building in King's Lynn. Now, some of you will know, who've been to many of my lectures, will know this is where I live. So it's a very good example for me. But here you see the lovely waterfront of Lynn with 19th century warehouse, 18th century buildings, there's a 16th century warehouse. And here is a 1970s court building. Brick of a very good scale, hip roofs, a tower. In fact, there are several towers along the waterfront. Here is a building that draws on the vernacular traditions of King's Lynn, but is of a modern style, and I think absolutely subjugates itself to the greater whole of the waterfront rather than trying to stand out and shout, "Look at me." I'm going to give you another example, and this is the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square. Now, many of you will be familiar with this building. I mean, the square, Grosvenor Square, is one of the largest Georgian squares in London, although many of the buildings round it are in fact now neo-Georgian replacements. When the Americans decided to build their embassy there in 1955, they chose the Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen, whose brief was to build something modern, but at the same time to acknowledge and respect the history and the visual traditions of London architecture. His, I think, actually brilliant response, which you see there in an old photograph, because you can't take this picture now because there are so many sort of security bollards and fences and policemen with machine guns and things around it. This, I think, is a brilliant response in Portland stone, a building which in mass, in its cornice height, in its window format, in its silhouette, accorded precisely with the Georgian square, whilst at the same time, it's a very accomplished work of contemporary design. Now, such buildings as the King's Lynn Crown Court and the American Embassy are very hard to pull off. And it's no coincidence that the two examples I've given you are both by architects of first rank. Lesser architects have been more often successful, I think, in pulling off contemporary designs in industrial settings. Buildings with and next to industrial sites are often much easier to and blend in with because of the prevailing technological aesthetic. Here is a recent development from the Barter site in Tilbury. The original Barter factory is being turned into flats, and the developer wants to build a number of new blocks next to the original. In fact, the intention was that Barter should have built more blocks, and so the new residential blocks are, in a sense, sort of completing the first design. So you've got old and new together at the bottom, and you've got the new above, and they blend in very beautifully, and the whole thing looks very harmonious and very successful. Warehouses, likewise, are very straightforward to reproduce and to blend in. This is the riverfront at Lancaster with a series of blocks of new flats that I think very much sort of echo the materials, the roofline and the scale of previous industrial buildings on the site. And here in Skipton, you will see some new houses. I have to point out which the new ones are. These are the new houses here. Which, again, I think do very well in replicating the materials, the roof lines of these sort of semi-industrial structures in Yorkshire. So it's now time to try and sum up. I suppose the fundamental point is that you can't separate a building from its setting and context. And so if you list a building or create a conservation area, you are also making an assessment not only of it, but of its surroundings. And those surroundings can be robust, as they often are in big cities, and they can be relatively impervious to change, or they can be extremely delicate and fragile, as in a smaller historic setting as like Skipton here on the screen. And here, in these smaller towns, I think you are dealing with a composite work of art, with all the subtle interplay that involves between places and spaces. The national planning policy framework recognises this, but because it was hugely slimmed down and the government won't accept any supplementary guidance, many planning authorities don't get the point, and so do not understand how to make judgments about new buildings in their historic cores. The people they employ are often not well equipped enough to do anything other than to bow to the economic pressures that they face and grant permission to stimulate growth as they see it. So there is a need, I think, to be brave, to be unfashionable, to talk about style, to talk about buildings that respect the scale, materials, and proportions of those with which they are going to stand. Some architects will hurl abuse and talk about pastiche, but they should look back through history and realise that all the most popular places to live, to work, and visit are places where changes have been made that preserve the essential harmony of the place. Many of the most reviled places are those in which the architects of the last 60 years have turned their backs on the past. But finally, and crucially, we must remember that sometimes, particularly in big, robust urban areas, it is possible and it is desirable to do something that stands out, that shocks, and that, in fact, can be good too. Well, next time, ladies and gentlemen, I shall be turning my attention to why heritage is important at all, what the arguments are for it, why we should care about big buildings, and what the economics of heritage and protection are actually about. But for this evening, that's everything. Thank you.